Good evening and welcome to the closing lecture of the second edition of the collaboration between the Japan House São Paulo and the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas. Started in 2020, the partnership has organized more than 20 events, promoting exchanges between Japanese and Brazilian scholars on some of the most relevant topics in current international relations, while also making them open and of free access to the public. My name is Luana Geiger, and it has been a great pleasure to moderate the debates. Tonight, we're welcoming back Professor Dr. Naoko Kumagai, who kindly joins us from an early morning in Japan, and Professor Dr. Matias Spektor to talk about multilateral policies and parallels between Japan and Brazil. Once again, I highlight that the statements expressed during the event represent only personal opinions and not necessarily the institutional position of Fundação Getulio Vargas. And also, all present here have agreed to participate and all have consented to be recorded in the broadcast. The audience is encouraged to participate by sending questions during the entire duration of the event through the Slido platform. The link to send the questions is available in the event description on YouTube. On this occasion, we are swapping roles, and the main lecture will be given by Professor Dr. Matias Spektor, Associate Professor and founder of the School of International Relations at Fundação Getulio Vargas, having received his PhD in International Relations from Oxford University. Professor Spektor, thank you for joining us again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much, Luana, and let me begin by thanking the Consulate of Japan in São Paulo, the Japan House, Luana Geiger for mediating these series of several lectures, which has been, I think it might be the longest running series on Brazil-Japan perspectives on global politics. And let me also thank Dr. Kumagai. It's a pleasure to see you again and then to swap roles today. What I've been asked to do and what I'm going to do is give you the mirror image of the lecture Dr. Kumagai gave us yesterday. Yesterday, what she did was give us a perspective of where and how Japan fits in its relationships with multilateralism and indeed with the United States and with the US-led order. So what I'm going to do today is run you through the argument of what Brazil's relationship with the liberal international order is. And in order to do that, and I promise to do that in about 30 to 35 minutes, is the following. I'm going to begin by defining what I mean by liberal international order. I will then establish what Brazil's attitude towards that order was during the Cold War, a time of bipolarity, where two major powers set the tone for global politics, the United States and the Soviet Union. Then I will discuss Brazil's attitude towards the liberal international order during the Unipolar Moment in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And then I'm going to close with Brazil's relationship with liberal internationalism today, looking forward. So those are the terms of reference for me tonight. So let me begin by defining liberal international order. This is going to be a very simple, practical, instrumental definition for our conversation. What in the literature scholars mean by liberal international order is the body of institutions that the United States built starting in the early 20th century, accelerating after the Second World War, and globalizing after the end of the Cold War. These are international institutions centered around certain liberal values, primarily economic openness and free trade on the one hand, institutional cooperation on the other hand, the notion that states better deal with the relationships if they are institutionalized, human rights and democracy, and US hegemony. And by US hegemony, the understanding is that here we have a major power that is not status quo, but is profoundly revisionist. From the earliest moment in the 20th century, as the United States rose to power, and then fundamentally after the end of the Second World War, US policy within this order has been one of revisionism, changing the terms through which global politics operate, creating new concepts, revising notions of sovereignty, expanding the range and the length of international institutions. So that's what I mean by liberal international order, is the body of institutions created, operated, and chiefly financed by the United States that is born in the early 20th century, and it expands globally as we move into the 21st century. So the question for tonight is, where does Brazil fit into that general picture? Let me begin by separating three periods then. First, I'm going to deal with the Cold War. So the period after the Second World War, between the mid-1940s all the way up to 1989, 1990. I will then talk about Brazil at the liberal international order during the Unipolar Moment in the 90s and 2000s, and then today. So let's begin with Brazil and the liberal international order during the Cold War. Brazil, by and large, unlike Japan, very different story, very contrasting with Japan, Brazil is a latecomer to liberal norms. And it's a reluctant comer to liberal norms. At no point during the Cold War is there an administration in Brazil that avidly moves towards liberal internationalism. There are many reasons for this. Part of the story, of course, has to do with the nature of Brazil's domestic regime. Brazil was, for the bulk of that period, a dictatorship. And during the moments during the Cold War, when Brazil was not ruled by a dictatorial regime, the democratic regimes of that day were not fully democratic because Brazil did not extend the vote to all citizens. There was no universal suffrage in Brazil until the 1980s. Only in 1985 did illiterates in Brazil get the vote. And only in 1989 did illiterates vote for president. So for all practical effect, during the bulk of the Cold War, it's very hard to describe Brazil as a properly functioning democracy. So it's understandable that during that period, successive administrations were reluctant to embrace liberal international norms. That's the first sort of explanation as to why Brazil comes in late and why it comes in reluctantly. The second argument is that the institutional design of Brazilian politics is such that this is a political system that is very good for capturing by interest groups. So special interest groups are particularly apt, because of the way Brazilian rules in the political realm operate, to capture the state. And one of the things we have learned is that what these interest groups want is protection from the state. It's not openness to the global economy. So Brazil, for the bulk of the Cold War, remained by and large a fairly closed economy. There are exceptions, but they are brief. By and large, this is a country that sees the state expand its size, and not only expand its size, but also shield the economy from international competition. Brazil is one of the prime examples of import substitution industrialization. So for the bulk of the Cold War, Brazil is not really properly integrated into global value chains. And it's rather slow at engaging capitalism, if we mean by capitalism, open, free capitalism. What Brazil develops is a type of inward-looking capitalism, so deeply integrated into global finance and international investment, but with the condition that the Brazilian state exerts enormous amounts of control over what goes on. Again, a very different story from the story of Japan. There is a third argument. During this period, the political ascendancy at home in Brazil is of an ideology of autonomy. This ideology portrays the world as a relatively dangerous place. It portrays global capitalism as very unstable, and therefore the expectation is that foreign policy will be all about securing Brazil some autonomy in the face of a nasty international system. And this is understandable, right? Because again, different from the Japanese story, Brazil happens to inhabit a place on earth that is marked by a regional hegemony. So within the regional hegemony built by the United States since the early 20th century, the space for maneuver for Brazil has been relatively limited. And within that world, foreign policy during the Cold War was largely about securing autonomy. Let me now move on to the unipolar moment. The unipolar moment, so the end of the Cold War and the onset of American hegemony starting in 1989, 1990, that period coincides with a major dramatic change in Brazilian domestic politics, which is Brazil's transition, very late transition, to democratic rule. So as I said before, in 1989, on the election of President Collor, Brazil has universal suffrage for the first time, which means for the first time the Brazilian poor get the vote. And this has a rather transformative impact on the outlook of Brazilian politics. So for the first time, there is bottom-up pressure from society for Brazil to open up to the global economy, partly because of inflation and at the time hyperinflation. So there is voter demand for all sets of reforms that begin to push Brazil in the direction of liberal global hegemony. So Brazil joins the Washington Consensus. It reforms its economy and begins to open it. It opens it very, very slowly. For the bulk of the unipolar moment, Brazil still is a relatively closed economy, but it begins to be more open than it had been the case during the Cold War. Brazil begins to join international liberal norms as well, but again, it does it selectively and it does it reluctantly. It does it very slowly. So, for example, Brazil doesn't really join the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is one of the pillars of the US-led order. This is a treaty signed in 1968. Brazil doesn't join until 1998, for example. Brazil is a very late comer to a number of norms and institutions in fields such as progressive human rights, all sorts of controls, not only around proliferation, but also around Brazil's space program, for example. Brazil doesn't really join and adapt norms regulating free trade until very late in the game, until the 1990s. And it doesn't really begin to reform its economy properly until then. But when it does, this is highly transformative. And all of a sudden, foreign policy begins to move in a direction which is far closer to liberal international order, far closer to US hegemony than it had been the case before. But here's the proviso. At no point does Brazil join the US bandwagon. This is not a story of alignment with the United States. Neighboring Argentina does alignment with the United States. Mexico does alignment with the United States. And certainly Chile and Colombia too move towards the United States, not Brazil. And the reason why it doesn't do it, it's partly because Brazilian governing elites believe Brazil is too big to be pushed around and too large to simply comply with US demands. But it's partly because the political class has no stake in joining the liberal international order wholeheartedly. The Brazilian political class, even under democratic rule, is still comprised of special interest groups with an ability to capture the state. This is a political class that still benefits from relative closeness in the economy, from an ideology of autonomy and separation from what goes on in the world, and from a genuine fear that any opening and bandwagoning with the United States will come at a very high cost for what Brazil has built. So Brazil's grand strategy starting in the mid-1990s begins to be this: moving closer to liberal internationalism and to US power, but to do it selectively, picking and choosing which goods from the liberal basket it wants, but also ensuring that in the process of joining liberal internationalism, Brazil is not going to be sucked up by liberal internationalism. And the way Brazil does it, cleverly at the time, is by building up regionalism in South America. This Brazilian turn to South America happens very late in the game. For many, many years, Brazil had a relationship with the rest of South America that was distant. So for you to have an idea, the first time a Brazilian head of state set foot in Peru or Venezuela, two neighboring countries, the first time ever in history was in the 1980s. Until then, no Brazilian head of state had ever visited any of these countries. Brazil had, of course, gone to war against Argentina over Uruguay, and it had gone to war against Paraguay. It had a long history of acrimony with Argentina. Part of the story has to do with the historical evolution of rivalry between the crowns of Spain and the crown of Portugal, the fact that Brazil was a Portuguese-speaking monarchy in the 19th century, whilst the rest of South America was comprised of Spanish-speaking republics rather than monarchies. It had to do with the fact that Brazil is a large piece of territory, and the capital city inside Brazil that is closest to the border is over 1,000 kilometers away from that border. So Brazil could afford to ignore the inland of South America. It had to do with the fact that Brazilian trade was mostly Atlantic trade, sea trade with Europe and then the United States, so on and so forth. But the point is that starting in the 1980s, successive Brazilian administrations begin to develop the argument that if Brazil is going to move closer to the United States and to the institutions that the United States set up, then Brazil needs a shield to protect itself from America's pull. And the best way to build that shield is to build a regional project. And the beginnings of that regional project take place in the 1980s, when Brazil and Argentina finally overcome their diplomatic rivalry, and they build up this strange, unusual, very productive system for mutual nuclear inspections, suspending fear on each side that the other side might one day weaponize nuclear energy, thereby creating a dynamic that ended up foreclosing security dilemmas in South America. After that gets done, then the project becomes one of trade integration, mainly with Argentina, but then slowly drawing in Uruguay and Paraguay, and then other associate states. And the notion there is that as Brazilian capitalism evolves, it would be useful for Brazil to have privileged access to the domestic markets of neighboring countries, in particular Argentina. And this is highly transformative for Brazilian industry in the 1980s as that project evolves. As we move forward, that project begins to have added bits to it. So by the late 1990s, Brazil now has, alongside Argentina, put forward a set of norms to do with protecting democracy. There is a democratic clause that applies to the countries in Mercosur. By the late 1990s and then in the early 2000s, Brazil seeks to expand that project, and it develops a regional organization called UNASUR. UNASUR is a political high-level setup of regular meetings between heads of state that then develops a defense side to it. And as the 2000s progress, Brazil begins to develop the argument that this regional project is going to be integral for Brazilian power and authority in international relations. And the acid test to this is when the United States proposes that the whole of the Western Hemisphere develops one single large free trade area for the entirety of the Americas. And Brazil opposes that project on the argument that South America first needs to integrate itself, only then to negotiate from a position of strength with the United States. And Brazil effectively helps kill any talk of a free trade area of the Americas. Brazil doesn't kill it on its own, of course. The US Congress helps kill it because the US Congress never really grants the US president the authority to negotiate such a treaty. But Brazil certainly organizes its foreign policy around building up South America as a distinctive autonomous region, that it's not set up against the United States. It's in cooperation with the United States. It's with the understanding and the support of the United States, but it helps Brazil resist the pull of US power. So that's the story by the time we get to the 2000s. And then in the 2000s, starting around 2004, we begin to see signs that liberal internationalism is under growing threat. Partly because of the rise of China, partly because the many problems inherent to global liberalism begin to show up. There is a massive protectionist movement coming bottom up from civil society against freer trade. There is a set of problems inherent to US interventionism the minute the Bush administration invades Iraq without authorization from the Security Council. There's a major blow to liberal internationalism when the pictures from Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq come public, so on and so forth. And within that context, what Brazil does is develop a grand strategy that is all about mitigating American unipolar power. This begins in the Cardoso administration. Towards the end of the Cardoso administration, Brazil is a vocal opponent of the war on terror as the war on terror was presented after 9/11. But then President Lula, who was elected in a late 2002 election, starting in 2003, he then expands this grand strategy and adds many other elements to it. So Brazil helps build the BRICS alongside China, India, South Africa, and Russia. Then Brazil helps develop IBAS with India and South Africa. Brazil then begins to try and build up institutionally a set of meetings between the South American UNASUR organization that Brazil created with similar organizations in Africa, the African Union, and the Association of Countries in the Middle East, and then a series of attempts to sign free trade agreements between Mercosur and various other parts of the world. Not with Japan at the time. That's coming forward. The argument here now is we are living a unipolar moment, and that is a good thing. I think that's the single largest difference between the grand strategies of Brazil and of Japan. If Japan on the one side, on the one hand, believes American power is a source of protection above all, and it's the most reliable and credible source of protection that Japan could possibly have, and that a rules-based liberal international order is the best global setting Japan could find to exist after the Second World War, a Japan that has relinquished the use of force itself. Brazil has a very different view. In Brazil's mind, unipolarity is a bad deal. And it's a bad deal not only because unipolarity means power out of equilibrium, but it's because in a unipolar system, the hegemon gets away with murder with little cost. And being in the one region of the world where the United States had for 100 years been a hegemon, Brazil developed the argument that unless there is a counterbalance, unless you have a modicum of balance against US power, then the world is going to suffer. Interestingly, this never translates in a policy of opposition to the United States or competition with the United States or acrimony towards the United States. Brazil retains a rather collaborative, productive relationship with the United States throughout the 2000s. There are no major problems in the US-Brazil relationship throughout the 2000s. And yet, Brazil is more reluctant to embrace US authority and ascendancy than most other large developing countries in the world. Certainly more than South Africa, but undoubtedly Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, as I said, but also the Turkeys of the world or the Indonesias of the world. So this is a story of using regionalism as a lever to gain autonomy from the United States. And throughout this period, autonomy remains one of the most powerful political philosophies of Brazilian foreign policy. Let me say a final set of words about the world moving forward. As we have seen, the past few years have coincided with a change in polarity yet again. We are very clearly no longer in a unipolar moment. We are now back to a multipolar system in which China in Asia and Russia in Eastern Europe, as we have seen the past few days, and the United States in the Western Hemisphere and in Western Europe and in the oceans, set the tone for global politics. what can we expect Brazilian relationship with liberal internationalism to be in such a context? I think there are 2 points that need highlighting. The first one is that Brazil is bound to confront very difficult dilemmas in facing up to great power competition. Although there's no doubt that the United States is the unchallenged regional hegemon in the Americas, it is also undoubted that China and Russia have made strides to try and have a foothold in Latin America. Russia has developed that in Venezuela and now in Nicaragua, and it's doubled down on that commitment since the annexation of Crimea in 2014 and in the years since. And that presence is primarily political and military. Cuba as well. So Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. But then China has a far more ambitious policy towards Latin America. China has expanded fast in Latin America. Now, most South American countries trade with China more than they trade with the United States. China has become a major source of foreign investment for these countries. It's become a major source of international support and cooperation on a range of issues. Chile, as we know, has formally joined the Belt and Road Initiative, and the Belt and Road Initiative is making strides and making advances throughout the Americas. China has become a major player in the Brazilian distribution of electricity. It's become a major player in Brazilian oil extraction, and it's become a major player in the production of electricity, not only inside Brazil, but in the countries surrounding Brazil, from whom Brazil purchases energy. That is very unlikely to change. And in fact, the minute the Trump administration began to push and shove Latin American countries to try and nudge them away from China, what China has done is double down on its commitment to having a foothold in the region, and rightly so, because China, like Russia, understands perfectly well that as they rise in Eastern Europe for Russia and Southeast Asia for China, the United States will have a foothold in those regions. The United States will operate in ways that try to complicate the ability of both Russia and China to build regional hegemonies in their own regions. So in response, both Russia and China, when they think about Latin America, what they think about is not so much Latin American countries individually, but is the relationship with the United States and the utility of having a lever in Latin America for dealing with the United States. None of this is to suggest that either Russia or China would contemplate projecting military power in Latin America or threatening US security from Latin America. If they were to do that, they would be absolutely mad, because of course the United States would respond with full force. One has to remember the United States developed the Monroe Doctrine, which basically says that no extra-regional power will have a foothold in the Americas in 1823. It then implemented in the late 19th century and throughout the first half of the 20th century. And that doctrine has not died and is very unlikely to die. And in fact, if you look at the way the United States has been behaving vis-a-vis Mexico and Canada, but also the Central Americans and the countries in the Caribbean basin, the Monroe Doctrine is very much alive. So not for a minute am I suggesting that either China or Russia will project power and threaten US security there. But they will certainly want to have a foothold and use that foothold as lever, the same exact way the United States does it with its partner countries and allies in Eastern Europe and in Southeast Asia. So moving forward, the first dilemma for Brazil will be how to deal with a world which is no longer unipolar, that it is now multipolar. The last time around that Brazil confronted that world, it was hard for Brazil. In the run-up to the Second World War, Brazil had a hard time reconciling its relationship with the United States and with Germany as the United States and Germany embarked on a very high-stake competition. The second point moving forward, I think, is this. As I said before, Brazil has been a latecomer to liberal internationalism and a reluctant comer to liberal internationalism. But the costs for Brazil of losing a rules-based order are enormous, and they are growing. And the problem with great power competition is that it makes the value of a rules-based order all the higher. But Brazil grew accustomed to critiquing, questioning, and trying to mitigate that ordering on the account correctly that this was a very unequal, top-down set of impositions from the United States on far weaker polities. The problem is that absent those sets of rules, in a context of great power competition, Brazil might find itself missing the time in which there was a rules-based order to critique in the first place. And I think, Luana, I will leave it there and leave plenty of time for us to have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Spektor. Without further ado, we will proceed to the discussions as I introduce our commentator, Professor Dr. Naoko Kumagai, professor at the School of Global Studies at Aoyama Gakuin University in Japan, having received her PhD in political science from the City University of New York. Professor Kumagai, it is a pleasure to host you once more, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ms. Geiger, and thank you very much, Dr. Spektor, for such a very comprehensive and very sharp analysis of this overall, long-term move of, Brazilian foreign policy in this worldwide, setting, particularly in terms of this liberal international order. And then I have two big questions. First of all, my first question relates to my curiosity about the hint for more diplomatic hint for a better use of regionalism. It is very impressive that how Brazil has used regionalism to alleviate any pressure or so-called influence from the United States. And then for its own, you didn't say this term, but maybe for, let me say that as a national interest or maybe regional interests. And then the thing is that this is quite contrasting to Japan's situation, as you also indicated. And then I think that, in a way, as I mentioned yesterday, why there has not been any regional security or economic forum in East Asia, I think it is really circumstantial situations. Then, the reason why, Japan has been, in comparison with Brazil, more dependent on or interconnected with the US as hegemon over the past 80 years or so, is because of this. Japan was a loser, and then Japan, in East Asia, many parts of the East Asia were divided under the Cold War, and then basically the link with the US was bilateral basis. So it was very difficult to create a multilateral forum there. But there was some attempts from Japan's side that, for example, even though Japan officially recognized Taiwan first after the end of Chinese Civil War, but actually the Japanese administration led by Prime Minister Yoshida wanted to open diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, but we couldn't with them because we had to, go along with the US. But Yoshida knew that China, the main continental China, had such a huge market and a huge potential for Japan. So Japan always knew that it's very important to have a very good relationship with mainland China, even though Japan has been we were needed America in many senses during the post-World War II period. But Japan also had, with that kind of calculation in mind, and then Japan tried several times for some regional, the creation of regional forum. For example, after the 1997 financial crisis, Japan proposed some kind of East Asian community idea, but with the IMF, rescue for the region, then Japan thought that Japan can also take some financial role and then create it as a regional forum. But that was ended up in failure, because of some pressure from America. So my question is that with this, very circumstantial limitations, and then but with some motivation, of more diversified, diplomatic relation for Japan, with particularly in the form of formation of regional organization. What was the success? My first question is that, what is the success of the use of regionalism for Brazil? And then I think my guess is that there was no particular, regional giant, regional major power in Latin America, even though I would say that Brazil is really regional power like India is. But we have a saying that, if you have a too big country in the region, it's very difficult to have a successful, really functioning regional organization. So I'd like to know the success of this regional organization, and then also the linkage of regional organizations across continent. So it is more like a question about diplomatic tip. And then my second question is your last point. You said that with this new era in which there's a rise of China and then more approach of Russia to this, Latin American, South American continent, Brazil is having a very good, well, selectively, very smart, maybe politically prudent choice in relationship with America and China and Russia, so that the bottom line of the security of Brazil or Latin America would not be harmed, but have a more constructive relationship with China and Russia. But with this very subtle balance of the relationship with the major powers, what is this Brazilian people's views of the ideologies or norms carried out by China and also Russia as going on now? In terms of this, liberal international order, as I mentioned yesterday, people might think this liberalism is good because that benefits me, but it is also liberalism might matter for people in terms of norm because that respects individual autonomy and then guarantee freedom. So in that case, even practical relationship with China and Russia, more than ever before, might give a sense of threat to liberal norms, which people enjoyed so far. So I'd like to know the Brazilian public and people's views of this China and Russia in terms of this liberal norms. These are my questions. Thank you very much.
These are two fantastic questions. Thank you so much. Let me take the first one. The first question is about regionalism. What's been the track record and the performance of Brazil's regional project? This is a superb question. So Brazil's project for regional buildup has suffered big losses in the last few years. To be sure, under the Bolsonaro administrations, it imploded. Bolsonaro has been unable and largely unwilling to lead the region. But the problems of regionalism began way before Bolsonaro. Mercosur decayed and it paralyzed. UNASUR imploded and to all practical effects ceased to exist some time ago. The ability of Brazil to honor the democratic clause of Mercosur collapsed in the face of Venezuela's turn into a dictatorship, so on and so forth. So the question is, what happened there? And I think part of the answer has to do with Brazil. And there are two elements, right? If you have a country that wants to build a regional project, you need to have two elements to it. First of all, you need to have an ability to offer your neighbors payoffs. Your neighbors need to feel that they will win if they join your project, right? That's the Germany model in Europe. It's providing the foundations for a regional political integration project in which you have a country that manages to provide public goods to the tune that ensures support from neighbors and ensures that the regional country will have followers, right? It's impossible to exert leadership without followers. The other alternative is to be able to coerce your neighbors. So you can have a regional power that builds up a political project among neighbors based on fear and on either the provision of security or the threat of the use of force. Now, Brazil never really developed the first one and could never really develop the second one. So this hegemony, one scholar calls it consensual. The problem is that there has been very little consensus in South America as to what norms and rules should be applied. South America is a deeply divided region now, and it's been deeply divided for many, many years. And it's very unlikely, I think, that any regional integration project is going to succeed unless there is a player that is willing and able to pay for integration. Brazil hasn't been that player. The question, of course, is, in the absence of Brazilian leadership, what happens to the region? And my fear is that as great power competition evolves, Latin America as a whole is going to become profoundly divided, as it was divided in the multipolar moment before the Second World War. And this would, of course, be a disaster for Latin Americans in general, but there we are. I don't think we're going to see an alternative scenario moving forward. With regards to your second question, which is a great question as well, let me tell you this. There are two levels, as you very correctly identified, right? One level is the level of policymaking, elites, governments, the degree to which Brazil will be able to navigate successfully the rise of multipolar competition. And the second question within that, the second point there that you raise, which is very important, is the role of public opinion. So let me take each one in turn. There is a profound consensus within Brazil's diplomatic elites that Brazil should not take sides between the US and China. And that position is perfectly understandable and it's morally defensible. And yet, as we know from history, whenever great power competition kicks in, it's very hard for countries not to take sides. Because not taking side is in itself taking side. So consider, for example, lobby over the 5G communications network. A decision as trivial as deciding whether China can or cannot compete in some public tenders to provide the service, this has been profoundly divided the Brazilian elite. So the notion that as we move forward, Brazil will be able to avoid making very tough decisions, I think is farcical. And trouble is coming, right? Because, as I said, the region is deteriorating fast. It's becoming deeply divided. Coronavirus has had a terrible negative impact on the economic outlook and prospects of Latin America. And the fact is that Chinese economic footprint in the region is now so large that traditional US allies in the region, like Chile and Colombia, are now confronting a world in which it's very hard for them to turn their back on China. Ditto for Brazil. Brazil has an enormous and growing dependence on China, economic, financial, not political or diplomatic, but certainly economic and financial. And the problem with that, of course, is that at an increasing rate, the fate of Brazilian local politicians is connected to the wealth of the Chinese economy. That level of dependence means that Chinese power and authority and influence in Brazil and in South America as a whole is going to grow. But as we also know, the United States is going to increasingly push and nudge Brazil and the other South American states and Latin American states in general to move away from China. That tension is coming, and there's simply, I think, no easy way for Brazilian elites to manage that tension. Then the question is public opinion, as you pointed out. And the fact is that we simply don't know. There are no studies in depth of Brazilian public opinion that look at how Brazilians, regular Brazilians, assess great power competition. What we know is very, very basic. So we are navigating in the dark. Happily, at FGV, there is a group of people now working on a series of surveys to try and make sense and better understand what's going on. In other Latin American countries, there have been surveys. They're mostly descriptive, and they're mostly to do with trying to identify what the perceptions of Latin Americans are about China and the Chinese and Chinese culture. I think we need to do much more. And again, we are shooting in the dark here. But that, I reckon, is going to change fast.
Thank you very much for the very insightful responses. Yes, I think it is better that we have questions from audience, because yesterday I talked too much. So yes. So Ms. Geiger, please.
Yes, thank you very much, professors. This was a great exchange. So we have received a few questions from the audience. I'm gonna send you the first one to our chat. And it says, currently Brazilian relations with Asia mainly occur in the economic sphere. Would it be possible to think of a more strategic approach towards Asia, and how could Japan fit into this?
Okay, so that's a great question. I would say this. I would agree with the notion that Brazil's relationship and interaction with Asia was, for the bulk of the recent years, mostly economic and trade. But increasingly in the last few years, it's become highly politicized. Remember that creating the BRICS was a major breakthrough for Brazil, of high consequence for Brazil's relationship with the rest of Latin America, and in particular with the United States. But more than that, remember that during the impeachment proceedings against President Rousseff, China became deeply and very politically involved in investing in what we call the pre-salt, so the under seabed oil reserves. Or remember that since the very early days of the Bolsonaro administration, China and the relationship with China became enormously politicized. I mean, we've had some of the president's sons pick fights with the Chinese ambassador over Twitter. The issue of China has become a topic of contention within Brazilian domestic politics. Of course, that's been light, in particular compared to what I think is coming, as China becomes ever more entrenched in the Brazilian economy and the United States tries to push that more forcefully. But I think the politicization of Brazil's relationship with Asia is developing fast, and it's now unavoidable. In terms of where Japan could fit, here's my sense. Japan is a major proponent of this concept called the free Indo-Pacific order. It's an attempt to provide and consolidate, rather than provide, to consolidate a set of rules in Asia, in the Pacific, and in the Indian Ocean. Japan is a major proponent of a rules-based system, and as we know and we learned yesterday, Japan is incredibly active multilaterally to make all of this happen. Brazil is a major beneficiary of a rules-based order. But we know from a fact that when Brazil and Japan sit together, they don't necessarily see eye to eye. One way forward, I think, is to try and bring Brazil more closely into the free Indo-Pacific concept that Japan has advanced. That's one. And the other one is, of course, a free trade agreement between Japan and Mercosur, which should have happened a long time ago, but it hasn't. So those two things, I would say, are, would be a good thing moving forward.
Thank you very much, Professor. And I think we have time for the second and last question. As Brazil seems to have abandoned an idea of regional leadership, how might this affect Brazil's ability to act in this new multipolar world power configuration?
That's really interesting. What's implied in the question is something that I do agree with, and it's this. Brazil is going into the multipolar world that is coming up now, and that the war in the Ukraine has accelerated, in a position of weakness. Brazil is now internationally far weaker than it was only 5 years ago. And 5 years ago, Brazil was far weaker than it was 10 years ago. Part of the reason behind Brazil's weakness is to do with the decay of Brazil's regional project. The regional project that Brazil developed in the 1980s and 90s, with all its problems, all its contradictions, and all of its difficulties, was a major power resource for Brazil, which is a country that does not have military power, and it's a country that has very limited economic power. So the ability to lead, the ability to build regional institutions was a major side to Brazilian influence in the world. That is now gone, and I don't see it coming back anytime soon, partly because the region is so fundamentally divided and decaying. So Brazil is moving into this new order in a position of relative weakness. But more important than that, I think, Brazil is moving into that world without really discussing alternative concepts of grand strategy. There seems to be this consensus that Brazil can get away with what we call equidistance. So the same distance from the 2 or 3 poles. That is never a viable proposition. Brazil couldn't do it in the run-up to the Second World War, and I think it's very unlikely that Brazil will be able to do it now. So I worry a great deal, and in answering the question, this, I think, will affect Brazil's ability to act very dramatically.
Thank you so much, Professor. As we approach the end of this event, I would like to once again thank very much both professors for joining us twice this week. We also thank the Japan House São Paulo for supporting the initiative and of course the audience. So to everyone in Brazil, we wish a great night and a great day to Professor Kumagai in Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to all. Have a good evening and a good day, Professor Kumagai. Pleasure.
Have a good evening, everyone. Have a good day, somebody in Asia or some part of the world. Thank you very much.